She arrived in a town God forgot, with nothing but a dead uncle's debts and a trunk full of broken dreams. Before she could even take her first breath, bullets started flying, and a stranger threw his body over hers, taking a shot that should have killed her. He disappeared without a word. No name, no explanation, just a trail of blood in the dust. But then, mysterious letters started appearing under her door. Every night. Someone was teaching her how to survive, how to rebuild, how to fight for her future. All from the shadows. She learned his name was Caleb Rowan, a man who hadn't spoken to another soul in 7 years. A man who came home from a cattle drive to find his wife and 2-year-old daughter already cold in the ground. So why would a man who wanted to die risk everything to save a woman he'd never met? And why was he helping her rebuild her life while refusing to rebuild his own? What happens when the woman he saved decides she's not going to let him stay broken? This story teaches us that healing doesn't mean forgetting the people we've lost. It means making room in our hearts for both the memories and the new beginnings. You can honor your past while still reaching for your future. The meaning. 2 shattered people proved that love after loss isn't betrayal. It's courage. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone in when everything inside you screams to stay hidden. If this message touched your heart, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been afraid to love again? Hit subscribe so you never miss a story that matters. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, share it with them. You might just change everything. The stagecoach had dropped Clara Bennett in a cloud of dust that tasted like the end of the world. Red Hollow felt like a town God had given up on, with a sign that said population 200, which seemed mighty generous. She had come to claim the general store left by an uncle she barely knew. It was all she had left. The coach driver pointed toward a leaning hotel and her uncle's store, noting it was the only one with its windows intact. As the stagecoach rattled away, Clara stood alone, feeling the cold stares of men from the shadows. She knew right then she did not belong. She clutched the handle of her trunk and started walking, every step feeling like a mistake. She should have sold the store and stayed back east where things made sense. But she was here, a lone woman in a town as rough as the land around it. She stopped in front of the bank to catch her breath, a building that looked solid as a toad. And that is when the ordinary world shattered into a million pieces. 3 masked men burst out of the bank, firing a pistol into the air. One of them hollered that the first person to follow them would be a dead one. Time seemed to stretch and slow down. Clara saw the cold, empty eyes of the lead gunman. She saw folks scattering for cover as the street erupted in pure chaos. But her own feet were stuck to the ground, frozen by a terror so deep it turned her to stone. The second robber turned his gun on her, a perfect helpless target. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body would not listen. Just then, strong hands grabbed her and yanked her backward off her feet. She fell hard against a man's solid chest as they crashed against the bank wall. A volley of gunshots ripped through the very air where she had just been standing. The stranger who had grabbed her covered her body completely with his own, his arm wrapped tight around her waist. He pushed her head down against his shoulder. His voice was low and calm when he spoke. "Do not move," he said. She was pinned between the wall and this man, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. As more shots rang out, she realized with a shock that he was purposely keeping himself between her and the danger, using his body as a human shield. When the gunfire finally faded, the stranger eased his grip. Clara looked up and saw a man with a face carved from granite and eyes the color of a deep twilight sky. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She could only shake her head, still trying to find her voice. He let her go and stepped back, his movement sure and steady. It was then that Clara saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt just above his hip. "You have been shot," she gasped. "It is nothing," he said, though the tight line of his mouth told a different story. "Just a graze." He put on his hat, hiding those serious eyes from her. "You saved my life," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I do not even know your name." He just looked at her for a long moment, then simply touched the brim of his hat and walked away, disappearing into the chaos as if he had never been there at all. Clara Bennett barely had time to register the gunshots before a stranger pulled her down, shielding her with his own body. He told her there was no need for names, just to be more careful, then walked away with a dark stain spreading on his shirt. Before she could process it all, a man named Thaddeus Blackwood was at her side. He was the lawyer handling her uncle's estate, and was mighty concerned she was hurt. Clara tried to ask about the man who saved her, the one with the piercing blue eyes. But Mr. Blackwood just shook his head. He said plenty of cowboys passed through Red Hollow and that they should get somewhere safe. He explained that her uncle's welcome wouldn't have been with gunfire and chaos, but Clara's eyes were fixed on the trail of dark blood drops in the dust. She had come to Red Hollow to claim a store, not to be saved by a ghost who took a bullet for her and vanished. Mr. Blackwood's office was a small, neat room that smelled of old paper. Clara's hands still trembled from the shock of it all. She asked him again if there was any way to find the man who had saved her, insisting she needed to thank him. The lawyer sighed, telling her that folks in a frontier town like Red Hollow often preferred their privacy. He advised her to let it go, saying the man would have given his name if he wanted to be found. Seeing her disappointment, he gently shifted the topic to her inheritance. He laid out the hard truth from a folder on his desk. Her uncle, George Bennett, had passed away 6 weeks ago. He had no wife or children, and had named her as his only heir. The estate was mainly the general store on Main Street, but it came with a mountain of his debts. The lawyer didn't sugarcoat it. The store was failing badly. Her uncle, a good man, had been a poor businessman, giving too much credit and stocking things that nobody wanted to buy. The building was owned outright, but it hadn't made a single dollar of profit in over 2 years. Clara felt that old, familiar weight of struggle settle back on her. It was the same feeling she had run 1,500 miles from Philadelphia to escape. Mr. Blackwood recommended she sell the place immediately. He even had a buyer lined up who would give her enough money to live on for a year or two back east. He warned that if she stayed, she would be working herself to the bone, fighting an uphill battle against bigger stores and her uncle's soft reputation. He told her kindness just does not pay the bills out on the frontier. Clara looked down at her work-worn hands. She thought about the suffocating life she had left behind, a future with no hope. Then she pictured the stranger's face, a man who risked his own life for hers without a second thought. Nobody in Philadelphia would ever do something like that. "I'll stay," she said, her voice clear and firm. A flicker of respect showed on the lawyer's face. He warned her that the store was in rough shape and that Red Hollow could be tough on outsiders, especially a woman running a business alone. But Clara was resolute. Mr. Blackwood nodded, agreeing to show her the store the next day and arranging a room for her at the local hotel. As she was leaving, he handed her a sealed envelope. It was a letter from her uncle, written just 3 days before he died. In her small, clean hotel room, Clara opened the letter. Her Uncle George's shaky handwriting filled the page. He apologized for leaving her a failing business in a town that felt like the middle of nowhere. He admitted he should have done more for her after her mother died, but he had been a coward. The store was not much, he wrote, but it was hers, completely paid for, which was more than most people had. He told her to sell it if she wanted, but if she chose to stay, she needed to know that Red Hollow was hard country. He urged her to find the good people hidden beneath the town's rough exterior, and to let them help her. His final words struck her heart. "Clara, do not be like me. Do not wait until you are dying to start living. Take risks, make mistakes, let people in, especially when it scares you." Clara read the letter 3 times. She did not cry. Instead, she stood by the window looking out at the dark, dusty street. This was her inheritance, a dying store in a forgotten town. But somewhere in that darkness was a man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind. Start living. For the first time in 5 long years, she felt more than just the grim will to survive. As she thought about the man with the secret-filled blue eyes, She felt a spark of something new. She felt truly alive and ready for whatever came next. Sleep wouldn't come for Clara that night. Every sound in that old hotel, boots in the hall, voices from the saloon, the wind howling outside, had her sitting bolt upright. When morning finally came, she put on her plainest dress, a dark blue cotton thing that felt more like armor than clothing. Looking in the mirror, she saw the same tired face as always, a woman who looked like she was made for fading into the background. But she couldn't shake the memory of those piercing blue eyes that made her feel seen for the first time. Downstairs, Mrs. McGinty served up a breakfast that was as tough as the town itself. The big woman with knowing eyes didn't waste any time. "You must be the Bennett girl," she said. "Heard about that bank robbery. A real shame for your first day. But I heard something else, too. Heard Caleb Rowan took a bullet pulling some Eastern girl out of the way." Clara nearly dropped her coffee cup. "Caleb Rowan? So that was you?" Mrs. McGinty said, a look of certainty on her face. "Girl looking lost, standing in the middle of the street like a darn fool." "Is he all right?" Clara asked, her voice tight with worry. "He'll live. Takes more than a scratch to put that man down." "You aiming to thank him?" "I would if I knew where to find him. He's got a place out past Eagle Ridge, about a 2-hour ride, but he ain't one for company." Mrs. McGinty leaned in closer. "A word of advice, honey. Caleb Rowan ain't the kind who wants thanks. He does what needs doing, and that's the end of it. Best you just let it be." But Clara couldn't let it be. He'd taken a bullet meant for her. Knowing his name only made her more determined to understand the man with the haunted blue eyes who would risk his life for a complete stranger. She went to see her inheritance after breakfast. The lawyer, Mr. Blackwood, met her at the store, and her heart just sank. Bennett's General Goods was a wreck. The sign was faded clean off, and the front window was so grimy you couldn't see through it. He handed her 3 keys and shoved the door open. Inside, a thick coat of dust covered everything. Shelves were either empty or sagging, the floorboards groaned, and the whole place smelled like damp and decay. This was it. This was all her uncle had left her. Mr. Blackwood pointed upstairs. 2 rooms up there. Stove needs a cleanin', and the privy's out back. Clara walked through the mess, her boots leaving tracks in the dust. A mouse scurried past her foot. This was her new life, a building full of failure. "The inventory ledger's on the counter," Blackwood said, "but I wouldn't trust it much." The back room was even worse, just a jumble of broken crates and ruined goods. "Miss Bennett," Mr. Blackwood said softly, "it ain't too late to walk away. I have a buyer who's still interested. You could take the money and start over somewhere else." "How much?" Clara asked, her voice small. $300. It was more money than she had in the world. Enough to get her back to Philadelphia, back to a life she knew was a dead end. She thought of her uncle's letter telling her to start living. She thought of Caleb Rowan, a man who faced danger head-on. "No," she said, her voice suddenly firm. "The store is mine. I'm staying." Blackwood sighed. "Well, you're either brave or a fool. Time will tell which." He warned her that most of her uncle's debts were from folks who never planned on paying. He told her running a store out here wasn't for the faint of heart. She'd be dealing with rough men who didn't take kindly to a woman in charge, and suppliers who'd cheat her blind. "I understand," Clara said again, though she wasn't sure she did. "Well, good luck to you, Miss Bennett. You're gonna need it." With that, he tipped his hat and left her all alone in the dusty ruin. For a moment, the job felt too big, just impossible. But it was hers. So she set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and started to work. By midday, she'd cleared the floor and managed to organize a single shelf. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she was hauling a busted crate outside, a woman with a kind, weathered face appeared at the door. "You must be Miss Bennett," she said with a warm smile. "I'm Sarah Pritchard. I heard you'd arrived. George would be glad to see his store alive again. It's sat empty ever since he passed." "I'm Sarah. I heard about what happened yesterday, how Caleb Rowan saved your life. Well, the thing is, news travels fast in a small town like this. I also heard you were asking about him, and that's what I came to talk about. Now, Clara, I'm going to tell you something that sounds harsh, but I mean it kindly. Caleb Rowan is not a man you want to get mixed up with. He saved you, and I'm sure he had his reasons, but those reasons weren't about starting something with you. You see, he lost his wife and his baby daughter 7 years ago in a cholera outbreak. He was off on a cattle drive. He came home to find them both gone and buried. It just broke something inside of him. He sold off most of his herd and shut himself off from the world. He only comes to town for mail and doesn't talk to anyone if he can help it. The best thing you can do for Caleb Rowan is to just leave him be. But he took a bullet for me, Mrs. Pritchard. A bullet that could have killed him. How can I just ignore that? You can respect what he wants, which is to be left alone. Out here, we respect a man's choice to keep to himself, especially after what Caleb has been through. I understand. Good. Now, I came to invite you to dinner tonight at my boarding house. You shouldn't be alone your first week here. The kindness in her voice made Clara's throat tighten. Thank you. I would like that very much. Be there around 6 o'clock. After Sarah left, Clara stood in the quiet, dusty store. She thought about a man so broken by grief that he had hidden from the world for 7 long years. She understood loss. Her own parents had died from a fever when she was just 9. She understood being lonely, but she could not imagine coming home to find your whole world dead and buried. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe leaving him alone was the kindest thing to do. But she could not stop wondering if he was all right, if his wound was healing, or if anyone was out there taking care of him at all. That evening, Clara walked over to Sarah Pritchard's boarding house. The place was warm, and the wonderful smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. Sarah welcomed her in. The dining room table was surrounded by women of all ages, and they all turned to look at Clara with open curiosity. Sarah introduced everyone. Mrs. Thornton, the blacksmith's wife, her daughter Emma, Mrs. Chen from the laundry, and Miss Alice Murphy, the school teacher. As they ate a hearty meal of roasted chicken and potatoes, the women asked Clara all sorts of questions. Emma Thornton's young eyes were bright with curiosity. I heard Caleb Rowan saved you. Is it true he got shot? Emma, her mother said sharply. It's all right, Clara answered. Yes, it is true. He just stepped right in front of me when the shooting started. That sounds just like Caleb, said Alice Murphy, the school teacher. He does not say much, but he acts when it matters. I was new here when his wife Mary passed on. She was a lovely, kind woman, always helping folks. And their little girl, Rebecca, was barely 2 years old. The sweetest thing you ever saw. The whole table fell quiet. When Caleb came back from that cattle drive and found them gone, Mrs. Thornton said softly, I have never seen a man break like that. He just stood in the cemetery day after day. We all thought we were going to lose him, too. After dinner, Sarah walked Clara back to the store under a clear, starry sky. I meant what I said about Caleb, Sarah told her gently. I understand, Clara replied. I will not bother him. After Sarah left, Clara climbed the stairs to her new home. She lit a lamp and looked at the 2 dusty rooms. Sitting at a small table, she pulled out her uncle's letter and read it one more time. Don't wait until you are dying to start living. She had made a choice to stay, to fight for this little store, to build a life. That was living, wasn't it? But as she blew out the lamp, she could not stop thinking about the man who was surviving, but not truly living. She could not shake the feeling that their story was not over. The moment he pulled her out of harm's way felt like a beginning, not an ending. The next morning, a letter was waiting for her, slipped right under her door. Her name, Miss Bennet, was written across the front in a strong, masculine hand. She opened it with trembling hands. The message inside was short and to the point. It told her the leak in her roof was in the back corner, and to patch it before the next storm. It said mice were getting in by the stove and to plug the holes with steel wool. It even told her where to find her uncle's supplier contacts. There was no signature. It was just silent help from someone who knew she was struggling. Clara's heart pounded. She knew then that Sarah had been wrong about Caleb Rowan. He wasn't done with her at all. The handwriting was careful, the words chosen by a man who didn't waste them. She knew it was from Caleb. No one else in this town would help her like a ghost in the night. That morning, she climbed up and found the leak right where he said it would be. She'd barely climbed down from the roof when her first customers walked in. She served them all, her hands still sticky with tar, hoping she was getting the prices right. One of them, a Mrs. Foster, looked around the store with a critical eye. She mentioned her children loved the peppermint sticks George used to keep by the counter. Clara promised to order some. The woman's face softened just a little, saying, "Well, you're trying, that's something." Later, Clara found the lockbox under the counter. Inside were all of her uncle's business papers. That night, another letter came. It warned her not to use the usual supplier for the peppermint sticks, saying he overcharged. It told her to pay cash, which meant she had to sell something. Clara looked around the tiny room. The only thing of real value was her mother's brooch, and she would sooner starve than part with it. She found her uncle's ledger and was shocked. Page after page showed money owed to the store. Tom Brewster owed $43 from 2 years back. The Halverson family owed $67. The Morrison Ranch was behind $112. Her uncle hadn't just been kind. He'd been careless. Clara knew what she had to do. She walked out to Tom Brewster's farm, ledger page in her hand. He was a skinny man with wary eyes who didn't stop working when she approached. "Mr. Brewster," she said, "I'm Clara Bennett. According to this, you owe the store $43. He finally looked at her. George never pushed folks for money. "George is gone," Clara said, her voice steady. "And I need to be paid." "Don't have it," he grumbled, telling her about failed crops and sick chickens. She looked at his worn-out farm and knew he was telling the truth. She couldn't take money from a man who had none. She told him to keep the debt, but that from now on he had to pay in cash. It was the same story everywhere else she went. By sunset, she had collected nothing and forgiven nearly $200 in debt. She felt like a fool, just like her uncle. But that night's letter told her she'd done the right thing. It said those debts were worthless anyway, and goodwill was more valuable. Then it told her what to do. There was a buyer in Helena who would pay a fair price for her uncle's pocket watch. The letter said it was in the lockbox, sterling silver, and worth about $60. He would have wanted her to sell it to survive. She found the beautiful watch right where he said. After wrapping it for the trip, she sat down and wrote a letter of her own. She left it on the counter, asking, "Why are you helping me? And why won't you show yourself?" The next morning, an answer was there. The letter said he didn't want anything in return. He was helping because she needed it, and that was reason enough. He wrote that he wouldn't show himself, and she could either accept the help or not. The words stung, but Clara started to understand. He had lost everyone he cared about. Letting someone get close must feel like a terrible risk. So he helped from the shadows. The practical side of her knew it should be enough. But the part of her that remembered his blue eyes and the feeling of safety in his arms wanted to see the man, not just his letters. In the weeks that followed, the letters became her routine. They were her lifeline, teaching her how to run the business and survive in this town. And with his silent guidance, Clara slowly began to build a new life. She slowly earned the trust of the women in Red Hollow. Sarah Pritchard brought her bread, Emma Thornton helped with shipments, and Mrs. Chen advised her on which cowboys to watch. Alice Murphy even helped with the bookkeeping. One night, Alice looked over the ledgers. "You are doing real well, better than George ever did. He did not have the grit for it, but you do." "I have had some help," Claire said, guarding her secret. Alice just smiled. "It is Caleb, isn't it?" Who else knew the business that well? He is still helping, just from a distance. I see smoke from his chimney when I am out riding. He is alive, if that is what you are wondering. Alice gave her a long look. "You are planning on riding out there, aren't you?" "Everyone tells me not to. They are right to. Caleb does not want company. But I see it on your face. You are thinking about him. As someone who cares for you both, I am telling you, do not go. He will only break your heart." Alice's voice was kind, but laced with a sadness as deep as a well. "Honey, I understand why you would feel that way. Caleb was a good man, a fine husband and father. When his Mary was alive, his smile could light up the whole town. But that man is gone. He was buried right alongside his wife and daughter. What you see now is just a shadow walking around. Clara thought of the careful handwriting in his letters, a sign that someone was still in there. I am not so sure about that. Alice shook her head. Do not mistake a helping hand for an open heart. It is easier for him to give advice from a distance than to risk letting someone in. That night, Clara wrote back, deciding to meet his caution with her own. Your advice about the Hicks account was solid. The store is turning a small profit. I might just make it after all. I will not ask for more than you can offer, but your help has meant the world to me. I hope you are healing up right. With thanks, Clara. She fought the urge to write more, knowing if she pushed too hard, he might just vanish for good. The next morning, a longer letter was waiting. The wound is nothing. You are doing more than surviving. You are building something. Your father was too kind for his own good, but you have a spine of steel he never did. The store will make it because you will not let it fail. Winter is coming, so stock up on lamp oil and coffee, and have Tom Brewster sweep that chimney. You let his debt slide so he will do a good job for you. That patch on your roof will not hold up to a heavy snow. I will fix it proper. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. I will fix it proper. That meant he was coming here. She was a bundle of nerves for the next 3 days watching the street. But he did not come by day. He came in the dead of night. She woke to the sound of soft footsteps on her roof. Pulling on her boots, she crept downstairs, drawn by a pull she could not explain. The store was bathed in moonlight, and she stood in the shadows, just listening to the sounds of him working above her. An hour later, the work stopped. Clara heard him climbing down the ladder out back. She made her mind up in an instant, opening the back door just as his boots hit the dirt. Caleb froze solid, his face hidden by his hat, looking like a wild thing caught in a trap. Thank you, she whispered, for the roof, for all of it. The silence stretched out between them. I am not trying to corner you, she said. I just needed to say thank you to your face. He finally spoke, his voice rough and deep like stones scraping together. The roof will hold. I do not know how to repay you, she said. He took a step back from the ladder. Just make the store work. That is repayment enough. Is it? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Is giving advice from the shadows truly all you want to give? She saw him flinch. It is all I have to give. I do not believe that. Then you do not know me. His voice went hard. I am not some romantic hero waiting for a pretty woman to save him. I am just a man trying to survive the day. Helping you gives me something to do besides stare at my own failures. The words should have stung, but she heard the raw pain underneath. I am not trying to save you, she said softly. I am just trying to know you. You cannot. He turned to leave. The letters will continue. But this, us talking in the dark, this has to stop. Leave your questions on the counter, and do not wait up for me again. This is all there is. He melted into the night. Clara stood in the freezing air, and she knew with total certainty that Alice was wrong. Caleb was not an empty shell. He was a man drowning in grief, but he was still fighting, still capable of caring. He was still alive in there. Clara understood building walls around your heart, but she was ready to tear hers down. The next morning, a letter from Caleb explained why his were built so high. He laid it all out, plain and simple. 7 years ago, while he was away on a cattle drive, he lost his wife, Mary, and their little girl, Rebecca. He came home to nothing but silence and 2 fresh graves. He wrote that if he ever let himself heal, it would feel like saying they never mattered. It was the first time he signed his full name, the first real piece of himself he had ever shown her. Clara knew that moving forward did not mean leaving loved ones behind. She wrote back, telling him how she lost her own folks to a fever when she was just 9. She said that just surviving is not the same as truly living, and helping her would honor his family. She left the note on the counter, not knowing what would come of it. The next morning, she was not woken by a letter, but by the sound of a hammer. Downstairs, there was Caleb in the daylight, fixing her warped front door. He did not look up, he just kept on working. When he finally spoke, he just grumbled that the door would have swollen shut by winter. Clara brought him a cup of coffee, and for a brief second, their hands brushed. It was a small thing, but it felt like a promise. The whole town stared as they passed, but Caleb paid them no mind. When the door was fixed, he gathered his tools. He said he would be back tomorrow for the shutters. He looked her right in the eye and said, "I am choosing to." And in that moment, Clara's heart knew something had changed for good. True to his word, Caleb kept showing up. He fixed the shutters, then the shelves, then a sag in the floor. They worked in a comfortable quiet at first, but slowly they started to talk. He told her how her uncle had brought him food for 6 months after he lost his family, never asking for a thing in return. He began teaching her the rhythms of the town, showing her how to read the weather in the sky and which folks to trust with credit. It was more than just repairs. He was helping her build a life. One afternoon, Clara told him straight, "You saved me." He tried to brush it off, saying he was just repaying an old debt to her uncle. But she knew there was more to it. He finally told her the truth. Seeing her in danger that first day was the first thing he had felt besides grief in 7 long years. He looked at her, his eyes full of fear and something that looked like hope. "This is the real me," he said, his voice rough, broken. Clara reached out and gently laid her hand over his. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I know." A few nights later, his letter was different. "Clara, I do not know what I'm doing. When I am with you, I feel something besides the pain, and it scares the hell out of me. I am afraid of what happens if I let myself care and then lose you too. But I am more afraid of what happens if I do not even try." Clara held the letter to her chest. He was offering her his broken heart, asking if she was brave enough to hold it. The next morning, when Caleb arrived to build her new storeroom shelves, she had made her choice. She was tired of being careful. She brought him his coffee just like always. But this time she did not walk away. She pulled up a stool, sat down right across from him, and decided to stay. She found him working inside the store and leaned against the doorframe. "I received your letter," she said softly. Caleb's hands went still, but he did not look at her. "Figured you would. You wrote that you are afraid of what happens if you let yourself care. My heart is pounding. But I am afraid too. After 5 years of keeping everyone away, I came here just to survive. Then you saved my life with those letters." He finally turned to face her, sawdust in his dark hair. "I do not know how to do this," she whispered. "How to let someone in. You are not the only one who is broken. Maybe we are both just trying to be whole again." Caleb took a step closer. "Clara, I do not know if I can be what you need. My hands are always shaking." She looked down at them. "They are not shaking now." He looked surprised. "No, I guess they are not. When Mary and Rebecca passed, I wanted to die with them. For months, all I thought about was riding off into the mountains and never coming back, just to stop the hurting. The only thing that stopped me was knowing Mary would have called me a coward." "I am glad you did not," Clara said, her throat tight. "Are you?" "Most days, I am still not sure I made the right choice. That is the man you would be getting, Clara. A man who is not sure he even wants to be alive." "I am not asking you to be whole," she said, closing the space between them. "I am just asking you to try with me, one day at a time." Caleb looked at her, a war of fear and hope on his face. He slowly lifted a hand and gently touched her cheek. "I am going to disappoint you." "Probably," she agreed, leaning into his touch. "I will probably disappoint you too. I do not remember how to do this. Then we will figure it out together." A customer's voice called out, breaking the moment. Caleb stepped back. "You should go handle your customer." Clara wanted to pull him back, but she knew better. Pushing a man like Caleb only makes him run faster. She served Mrs. Thornton and her daughter, politely dodging their prying questions about the man in her back room. After they left, she found him gathering his tools. He mumbled something about checking on his ranch, avoiding her gaze entirely. "Do not make this more than it is, Clara," he said, his voice cold. "I am just fixing your shelves." The words hit her hard. He left, the back door slamming shut, leaving Clara to wonder if this was the price of getting close to him. For 4 long days there was nothing. No letters, no word. The silence was deafening. Clara buried herself in her work, trying to ignore the knot of panic in her stomach. The store was finally doing well, and the folks in Red Hollow were starting to treat her like a neighbor. But none of that victory felt sweet without Caleb there to share it. Then, on the 5th morning, she discovered a wrapped package on her doorstep. It was a heavy rectangular book, old and leather-bound, titled Practical Business Management for Western Merchants. A note inside explained everything. The book belonged to Mary, his late wife. Caleb wrote that he always runs from good things because he is terrified of losing them. But running from Clara felt worse than staying. He was trying, he said, and he would be there that afternoon to finish the shelves. Clara pressed the book to her chest, tears streaming down her face. This was more than a book. It was his trust. He was sharing his past, his grief, and his wife's memory with her. He was showing her that moving forward did not mean forgetting. When Caleb arrived, Clara was waiting. She did not say a word, just handed him a note she had written. It said she understood his fear, but she was not going anywhere. That she was not trying to replace Mary, but hoping there was room for something new. He read it, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Then he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. He held on tight, like she was the only solid thing in the world, and she felt 7 years of grief begin to tremble out of him. "I am terrified," he whispered into her hair. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice raw. "Why fight for a broken man like me?" "Because you are worth fighting for," she answered, her voice steady. "And because you make me feel alive." He kissed her then, a soft, questioning kiss, filled with both hope and fear. "We will figure this out," she promised when they parted. "We can mess it up together." A rusty sound that might have been a laugh escaped him. He stayed to work on the shelves, and as Clara helped her next customer, she knew he was not running, not today. And for now, that was everything. They talked for hours, not about his family, but about his childhood and the cattle drives from before. Clara told him about her years as a seamstress in Philadelphia, making dresses for women who looked right through her. "You are not invisible now," Caleb said, watching her with a startling intensity. "Not here. You are the most visible person in Red Hollow, the woman who made Bennett's store work and did not run when things got tough." "They talk about you, too," she said quietly. "About how Caleb Rowan finally came down from his mountain to help me." "Let them talk," he said. But his jaw was tight. "Does it make you want to run?" "All the talk?" "It used to," he admitted, looking at her with a hint of wonder. "But now, I reckon staying with you is worth all the fuss." That night she found another letter under her door, but this one felt different, more personal. "Clara, for 7 years I believed my heart had no more room. I thought loving again meant paving over what I had with Mary. But you made me wonder if a heart just adds another room when it needs to. I'm not saying I'm all healed, because I am not. Some days the grief hits me like it was yesterday, not 7 years ago. I want to try with you, though. I want to see if I can be more than just a man who lost his family. You scare me, Clara. Caring for you feels like asking for trouble. But not caring, well, that scares me a whole lot more. So here I am, terrified but trying. Yours, Caleb." Clara read his words 3 times, tears blurring the ink. He signed it, "Yours," a promise and a risk in one word. She wrote back right away. "Caleb, yes, I am scared too. But I will be scared with you. I will take the bad days. I will give you space, and I will hold you close. We will build this one day at a time. You are not alone in this anymore. I am here. Yours too, Clara. The next morning, Caleb showed up with the coffee. That simple switch made Clara smile. They sat together, their shoulders touching in a comfortable quiet. The store needs a better sign, Caleb said after a while. I can barely read the old one. I know. It is on the list for when I have the money. I can make one at the ranch, he offered. Clara looked at him, hearing what he really meant. He was planning to come back to be a part of her life. I would like that, she said softly. He then pulled a small cloth-wrapped object from his pocket. This was for Christmas, but I am worried I will lose my nerve. Clara unwrapped it and found an old iron key. It is to the ranch, Caleb said, his voice rough. In case you ever need a place to go. Or if I disappear for a few days and you get to worrying, you can come check on me. The gift was enormous. It was 7 years of his solitude, a trust that left her breathless. Thank you, Clara whispered, her hand closing around the key. I will take care of it, and you. The key stayed in Clara's pocket for 3 days. Going to his ranch meant walking into the heart of his grief, where Mary and Rebecca's memories lived. But on the 4th morning, when Caleb did not arrive with coffee or a letter, a cold knot formed in her stomach. She knew he was drowning in one of his bad days. So Clara closed the store, left a note on the door, borrowed a mare from Sarah Pritchard, and rode north toward Eagle Ridge. The cold November wind cut right through her coat. She nearly turned back twice, but the thought of Caleb facing his pain alone pushed her onward. The ranch was a small log house and a worn-out barn. Smoke curled from the chimney, but the place was still and silent as she tied up the horse. She took a deep breath, walked up to the porch, and knocked. When no one answered, she knocked again, louder. Caleb, it is Clara. I'm coming in. She used the key, her heart pounding as she pushed the door open. The room was dark, lit only by a fire in the hearth. Caleb sat at a table with his back to her. A whiskey bottle stood beside a single piece of paper in his hands. He did not turn or speak. You should not be here, he finally rasped, his voice broken. This is one of the bad days. I am not going anywhere, Clara said, moving around the table to face him. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollowed out. What happened? Nothing happened. That is the problem. He set the letter down as if it were made of glass. I woke up this morning and could not remember Rebecca's laugh. I tried for an hour. It is just gone. If I am forgetting her laugh, what else is slipping away? Clara's heart ached for him. She pulled up a chair and sat close, giving him his space. Tell me about her, about Rebecca. What is the point? He asked, his voice raw. Talking will not bring her back. No, Clara said softly, reaching for his hand. But it might help you remember. He stared at their joined hands, and for a long moment he was silent. Then he began to speak. She was 2, had Mary's blonde hair and my eyes. She loved horses, and she called me Papa. His voice cracked. Her laugh, it was like bells, high and clear, like the whole world was a wonderful secret. His hand tightened on hers. When the fever came, I was 300 miles away on a cattle drive. By the time Mary's letters reached me saying they had a cold, they were already gone, both of them. He finally looked up at her, the anguish in his eyes a bottomless well. Is that not my fault? It was my fault. I picked that cattle drive and the money over my family. If I had been here, I could have gotten the doctor sooner and saved them. Clara shook her head firmly. Or you would be dead too. That sickness does not care about good intentions or love. It just takes. You being here would not have changed a thing. You can't know that for sure. Neither can you. But I do know that punishing yourself for 7 years will not bring them back. It is just stealing the life you have left. Mary would not have wanted that. Caleb gave a short, bitter laugh. Everyone says that. But Mary is not here, is she? She does not get a say in how I grieve. No, she does not. Clara moved closer, her voice soft. But you do, Caleb. You get to decide. You can keep drowning in what was, or you can start living again. It is not a betrayal to remember Rebecca's laugh while also making new memories. That is not betrayal. That is love. I am scared, he admitted in a whisper. If I let go of this hurt, I will lose them for good. This pain is all I have left. That is not true. You have the memories. You have the life they wanted for you. The pain does not honor them, Caleb. It is just pain. He pulled his hand away and walked to the fireplace. The letter I was reading, he said, his back to her. Mary wrote it 3 weeks before she died. She thought she was pregnant again. She wrote about our future, about the children we would have, about growing old together on this ranch. She was so happy, Clara. She died believing all those dreams would come true, not knowing they would all turn to ash. She died loved, Clara said gently. She died knowing her husband adored her and her daughter was safe. In her final moments, she had the love she had built. That is not nothing, Caleb. He turned around then, tears finally tracking down his face. I do not know how to let it go. Then do not. Clara closed the distance between them, wrapping her arms around him as he finally shattered. Do not let go. Just make room. Make room for the grief and the love. And for me. For us. Caleb buried his face in her shoulder and sobbed, letting out 7 years of grief he had held inside. Clara just held on tight. When the storm passed, he pulled back. I am sorry. You should not see me like this. Where else would I be? Clara asked, cupping his face. This is part of it. The good days and the bad, I am still here. Why? He asked, his voice barely there. Why would you want me? Because underneath all this sorrow, you are a good man, Caleb, a kind man. You help strangers and write letters in the dark. You build shelves for a woman you hardly know just because it is the right thing to do. Clara's thumb brushed away a tear. And because when you look at me, I feel like you really see me. You are worth fighting for, Caleb Rowan, even when you do not believe it. He kissed her then, a kiss full of desperation and gratitude. And Clara kissed him back, pouring all her strength into it. Stay, he pleaded when they parted, just for today. I will stay, Clara whispered. He showed her the ranch, the quiet barn, and the small, overgrown garden where Mary had planted vegetables. They walked to the little cemetery on the hill, where 2 simple wooden crosses stood side by side. Mary Rowan, beloved wife and mother. Rebecca Rowan, our little angel. I come here every morning, Caleb said. I tell them about my day. I tell them about you. You told them about me? I had to. You are the biggest thing that has happened to me in 7 years. I tell Mary that you are stubborn and brave and that you make terrible coffee. I tell Rebecca she would have liked you, that you have kind eyes. I like to think they are glad I'm not alone anymore. I think they are too, Clara said, taking his hand. I do not think I remember how to be happy. Then we will figure it out together. They walked back to the house as the sun set. Inside, Caleb made a simple supper of beans and bacon. This house is so quiet, Clara said softly. How do you stand it? You get used to it. I used to think I could still hear Mary singing or Rebecca laughing. Then it just became quiet. It feels different with you here. Better. You could come to town more often, Clara suggested. Stay in the rooms above the store. You have been fixing them up anyway. Are you asking me to move in? I am asking you to think about not being so alone. Caleb was quiet for a moment. People will talk. Let them. At least we would be together. Clara reached for his hand. I am not trying to push you, but I want us to be a real part of each other's lives, not just stolen moments. I do not know if I can live in town. Too many people, too much noise, then I will come out here. Then I will come. We will make it work, but Caleb, I need you to meet me halfway. I cannot be the only one reaching all the time. He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. You are right. I am sorry. I have been taking your patience and your kindness and giving nothing back. That is not true. It is. He looked down at her. You have been carrying me, and I have been so lost in my own misery that I never stop to think about what you need. I want you, Clara said simply. All of you. But I need a partner, not a project. Someone who is willing to try as hard as I am. Then that is what I will be. He kissed her gently. Starting now. You came all this way for me. You held me when I fell apart. You stood at my wife's grave, and you did not run. That is more than trying, Clara. That is love, even if we have not said the word yet. Is it? Yeah. His voice was a whisper. It is, and it terrifies me. But I'm so grateful for you, for being stubborn enough to not give up on me. They stood there as the world outside grew dark, feeling a new understanding settle between them. She had come to comfort him through a bad day. She had not expected to find a new beginning. That night, Clara slept in Caleb's bed, and he took a blanket on the floor. It was an unspoken agreement. As she drifted to sleep, she heard his steady breathing in the dark, and felt safer than she had in years. The next morning, they rode back to town together. Caleb started tying his horse outside the store each morning. He was just there, a quiet presence while she worked. The town noticed. Is he staying for now? Sarah Pritchard asked, her eyes wide. It seems so, Clara said, smiling. Well, it is about time. Soon, Caleb's presence became a normal thing. He would come to the store, finish the sign he promised, and even take meals with her. He bore the town's whispers with a quiet grace, even managing a smile now and then. He is more alive than I have seen him in years, Alice Murphy told Clara one afternoon. We are both trying, Clara said. Alice paused. There is a harvest social next month. The first one since you came. Will you come? She glanced at Caleb. I do not know. That might be too much for him. Maybe, Alice said. Or maybe it is just what he needs. Think about it. That night, Claire brought up the social while they ate stew. A town social. Caleb said the words real slow like they were something foreign, with dancing and music and the whole town watching. Clara's spoon stopped dead in the air. We should go, he said, his voice firmer this time. You've been meeting me more than halfway, putting up with my need to be alone. The least I can do is stand by you at a town gathering. Let folks see I ain't completely lost. Clara told him he did not have to do anything that made him miserable. It is not about that, Caleb said, taking her hand. It is about being your partner. It has been 7 long years of hiding. Maybe it is time to stop. His smile was small, but it was real. For you, he said. For us. The night of the harvest social was crisp and cold. Fiddle music spilled out from the town hall. Clara wore her finest green dress, nervous as a cat in a room full of rockers. She knew walking in there with Caleb meant telling all of Red Hollow they were together. Caleb met her looking like a man headed for the gallows, but his hand was steady when he offered it. Ready? He asked. Not even a little bit, she said. Let us go anyway. When they stepped inside, every eye in the place landed right on them. The music kept playing, but the talking died down to a whisper. Clara felt Caleb tense up beside her, ready to bolt. She just squeezed his hand and whispered for him to breathe. No, he said, straightening his shoulders. We are here. Might as well see it through. Folks started talking again after a minute. Sarah Pritchard brought them some cider, and the new reverend shook Caleb's hand like an old friend. Caleb just sat there, quiet and dignified, and he did not run. When the music turned to a waltz, Clara watched the couples on the floor, a little bit of longing in her heart. Dance with me, Caleb said all of a sudden. Clara stared at him, stunned. He stood and offered his hand, looking nervous but determined. I ain't danced since Mary passed, he admitted, but I want to try. With you. She took his hand, her heart pounding, and let him lead her to the floor. He was clumsy and he held her a little too tight, but he was trying. That was everything. I cannot believe you are doing this, she whispered. Neither can I, he said, holding her just a little bit closer. It was about living, not just getting by. It was about making peace with the past while looking toward the future. It was about the two of them. "Caleb Rowan, are you trying to tell me you love me?" He nearly tripped over his own boots, but caught himself steady. "Yeah, I reckon I am. Scared to death of it, but it's the truth. I love you, Clara Bennett. I love how stubborn you are, how kind you are, and how you keep trying to make coffee even though it's awful." He smiled a little. "I love that you see me, not just the broken pieces, and that you're patient enough to wait for me when I need to run." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I love you too. Your sorrow, your fears, and the quiet way you help folks because you can't help but care. I love your rare smiles and the letters you write when you think no one's looking." They held each other right there on that dance floor, a whole world away from the crowd. Clara knew this was it. This was the moment Caleb chose to step back into the light. When the music stopped, he just held her close, his forehead pressed to hers. "Thank you," he breathed out, "for not giving up on me." "Always," she whispered back. "I'll always see the man worth saving." They walked home under that big December sky, his hand warm in hers, knowing the hardest part was finally behind them. 3 days after that harvest social, winter came to Red Hollow in a hurry, dumping a blanket of snow that hushed the whole world. Clara woke to frost on the windows and a deep chill in the air. Downstairs, a letter was waiting for her on the counter. Caleb's letters had changed lately, grown warmer and more personal. This one said, "Snow's here. Roads are going to be a mess, but a day without seeing you just feels wrong now. I'll bring some firewood." Clara clutched the paper to her chest. Just 4 months ago, she was all alone in Philadelphia with nothing to her name. Now she had a thrive in store, a town that felt like home, and a good man who'd ride through a snowstorm just for her. Caleb showed up mid-morning, his horse stepping carefully. He stacked a generous load of firewood by her back door, snow dusting his hat and coat. "You didn't have to come out in this," Clara said, handing him a cup of coffee that she knew was still probably terrible. "Yes, I did," Caleb said, warming his hands on the mug. "Figured if I didn't come today, it might be a week, and that wouldn't sit right with me." He looked straight at her. "Yeah, that would bother me." They settled into their easy rhythm, Clara helping the few customers who braved the weather, while Caleb got to work building her new shelves. But something was off with him today. He seemed distracted, his mind a million miles away. "What is it?" she finally asked, finding him staring into space in the back room. "Nothing's wrong, Clara." She touched his arm gently. "I can tell when something's weighing on you. Talk to me, Caleb." He put his hammer down. "It's December 9th. The date meant nothing to her, so she waited. "It's Rebecca's birthday. She would have been 9 years old today." His voice was thick with pain. "And the first thing I thought of this morning wasn't her. It was you. And then I remembered the date, and I just felt guilty. Like I'm betraying her memory by being happy." Clara's heart just broke for him. "Oh, Caleb, you're not betraying her by finding happiness. She was your little girl. She would want you to be happy." "How can you know that?" he asked, his hands tightening on hers. "She was only 2. I'm forgetting the little things, Clara. And now that I have you, it feels like I'm leaving her behind for good." "You're not forgetting her," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You're just learning how to carry her with you. Your heart made room for me, remember? That doesn't mean there's any less room for her. Grief is a liar, Caleb. It tells you that moving on means letting go." She pulled back to look him in the eye. "Tell me about her birthday. What would you all have done?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Mary would have baked a chocolate cake. We'd have given her something to do with horses. Then, after she was asleep, we'd sit and talk about how fast she was growing up." "Then let's do something to remember her," Clara said, her voice firm. "Not to grieve, but to remember the joy she brought into this world. That matters. That's worth celebrating." After a minute, Caleb gave a slow nod. All right, what'd you have in mind? They closed the store at noon and walked through the crunching snow to the little cemetery on the hill. Clara gave him some space as he knelt by the small wooden cross, gently brushing the snow away. Hey, baby girl, he said, his voice soft. Happy birthday. You'd be 9 today. I brought someone to meet you. Her name's Clara, and she's real special, Rebecca. I think you would have liked her. Tears ran down Clara's face as she listened. I'm trying to be happy again, Caleb went on. It's hard, and sometimes it feels wrong, like I'm leaving you and your mama behind. But Clara says my heart has room for all of it. The sadness and the love, the memories and the future. And I'm choosing to believe her. He stood up and reached for Clara's hand. She stepped up beside him. Rebecca, Clara said quietly. I never got to meet you, but I promise I'll take good care of your daddy. I'll remind him to eat, and I'll hold him on the bad days. And I promise I will never ever try to take your mama's place. Caleb's hand squeezed hers tight. When she looked over at him, he had tears on his face too, but for the first time they looked like tears of peace. Instead, he just guided her upstairs. Caleb pulled her in close, holding on like she was the only thing keeping his boots on solid ground. In the quiet of her room, they finally talked. He spoke of Kentucky, of a hard but fair father, and of Mary, the wife he had lost. He told her about his little girl Rebecca, and how holding her for the first time made his whole world bigger. Clara shared her own story of loss, of a loneliness so deep she hardly noticed it anymore. She talked about working her fingers to the bone just for a room of her own, and how a letter about a dusty old store felt like her last chance. I am glad you took that chance, Caleb said softly, and I am glad you were too stubborn to let me run you off. Clara leaned into him, feeling a sense of peace she had never known. That night, when the gray light of dawn crept in, Caleb was still there, just watching her. Morning, he said. Let folks talk, Clara replied before he could speak of leaving. We have been working side by side for months. The only ones pretending we are not together are us. A real smile finally broke across his face. You are right, as usual. He promised to stay, not just for breakfast, but for good. In the weeks that followed, Caleb became a fixture in her life, splitting his time between the ranch and the store. They were just a part of Red Hollow. But not everyone was happy about it. One afternoon, 3 hard-bitten men rode up looking like trouble on horseback. The leader, a big man with a nasty scar through his eyebrow, got down from his horse. This Bennett's place? He grunted. Name is Jack Carver. We are looking for ranch work. Heard your fella, Caleb Rowan, might know who is hiring. A chill went down Clara's spine. I can ask him, she said, her hand tight on her broom. We will be at the saloon, Carver said, his smile all wrong. Tell him Jack Carver's back in Montana. She found Caleb in the back, and when she told him, the color drained from his face. I know him, Caleb said, his hands starting to shake. We rode together on cattle drives years ago. He was a wild card then, with a mean streak a mile wide. Last I heard, he was in a Wyoming prison for rustling. What is wrong? Clara asked, seeing the real fear in his eyes. The bank robbery back when you first came to town. 3 men, $5,000, and a dead clerk. They were never caught. Her stomach turned to ice. You think it was him? I think, Caleb said, his voice low and tight, that Jack Carver knows I got a good look at him that day. He is not here for work, Clara. He is here to silence the only witness. We have to tell the sheriff. And say what? That I have a bad feeling? That is not enough to get him arrested, but it is more than enough to get me killed. We just have to be careful, Caleb insisted, but they both knew careful would not be enough. For 3 long days, an ugly quiet settled over the town. The Carver brothers stayed at the saloon, drinking and waiting. Caleb never left Clara's side and kept his gun close. On the 4th day, as dusk settled, the trouble they were waiting for walked right through the door. Jack Carver stood there all alone, with that same wrong smile on his face. Clara's hand slid toward the pistol Caleb had hidden under the counter. Evening, Miss Bennett, Carver said, his eyes cold as a mountain winter. Hope I am not bothering you. Clara kept her voice steady, her hand resting near the gun she kept under the counter. "We are closed," Carver just smirked. "I am not here for supplies. I am here to talk about Caleb Rowan. He is not here." "I know," Carver said, leaning on the counter and getting way too close. "Saw him ride out an hour ago. That is why I'm here now. See, I got to thinking. Caleb pulled you out of the way awful quick during that bank robbery. Almost like he knew it was coming. He saved my life. Or maybe he saw someone he recognized, someone who would be a real problem if they could identify him." Clara's heart hammered in her chest, but she held his cold gaze. "You are threatening me." "Not threatening," he said with a slick smile. "Just explaining. Caleb cares about you. So if something unfortunate were to happen to you, he would be real motivated to forget anything he saw. Might even be motivated to just leave town for good." "Get out," Clara said, her fingers finding the pistol grip. "Or what? You will shoot me?" Carver laughed. "I do not think so. You are not the type. But Caleb is. What do you want?" "I want Caleb Rowan to forget my face." Carver looked right through Clara, his voice low and dangerous. "You have 3 days to convince Caleb to mind his own business. After that, my brothers and I are fixing to solve the problem ourselves." He glanced around her tidy little shop. "It would be a real shame if this place burned down with you inside." The door slammed, leaving Clara frozen with fear until her legs gave out. That is how Caleb found her 20 minutes later, crumpled behind the counter. She told him everything, and the kind man she knew was replaced by someone cold and hard. "He threatened you," Caleb said softly. "We are going to the sheriff right now. This cannot wait." They locked the store and hurried through the dark to the home of Sheriff Tom McKenna, a tough man who had been the law in Red Hollow for 20 years. The sheriff listened, his face growing more grim with every word. "Jack Carver," he said. "He is a wanted man. We need to move fast." He looked at Caleb. "The immediate problem is his threat against Clara. That makes him dangerous tonight." McKenna reached for his gun belt. "I will round up my deputies and we will arrest them before sunrise. Miss Bennett, you need to go somewhere safe." He suggested a boarding house, but Clara insisted Caleb stay with her. "I would not have it any other way," Caleb promised. They slipped back to the store in the dark so Clara could pack a few things. She had just closed her bag when a gunshot echoed down the street. Caleb tackled her, pushing her to the floor as the front window exploded into 1,000 tiny pieces. "They saw us go to the sheriff," Caleb growled, shielding Clara with his own body. "Stay behind the counter." He moved to the shattered window, his pistol ready. He could see 3 men outside. Carver's voice cut through the night. "Last chance, Caleb. Leave the girl and ride on." Caleb's reply was firm. "Not happening." Gunfire ripped through the store, splintering her shelves and inventory. Caleb fired back, but they were trapped and badly outnumbered. Just when all hope seemed lost, new sounds filled the air. More gunshots erupted from the street, followed by the thunder of hooves. Sheriff McKenna's voice boomed, "Drop your weapons! You are surrounded!" A few moments of chaos followed, and then an eerie silence. Caleb peeked outside. "It is over," he said, relief in his voice. "McKenna got them." Clara stumbled to the window and saw Carver and his brothers in the torchlight, their hands held high. While deputies were getting Carver and Sam in irons, McKenna holstered his pistol. "Y'all all right in there?" he called out. Caleb assured him they were fine. "Good. We'll get your statements come morning. Find somewhere safe to land for the night." Clara just stared at her store. The windows were blown out, the walls looked like Swiss cheese, and her inventory was destroyed. All her hard work, gone. She fought back tears as Caleb wrapped his arms around her. "We'll fix it," he promised softly. He turned her to face him, his voice firm. "I will never let anyone hurt you. I love you, Clara." And right there in the wreckage he asked, "Will you marry me?" "I know this ain't the most romantic spot," Caleb said, his voice finding its strength. But with bullets flying, all I could think about was wanting a lifetime with you. I'm tired of being afraid." Tears were streaming down Clara's face, but she was smiling wide. "Caleb Rowan, I love your stubbornness and the awful coffee you bring me every morning. I love that you stood up for me and wouldn't leave." She looked him straight in the eye. "Yes, of course the answer is yes." He kissed her then, a deep kiss full of promises. As the lawman led Carver's crew away, Clara knew this was the kind of love worth fighting for. They spent the night at Sarah Pritchard's, but sleep wouldn't come. Caleb sat in a chair by the window, his gun close. "Every time I shut my eyes," he said in the dark, "I see you on that floor. What if my past keeps putting you in danger?" Clara sat right up and cupped his face in her hands. "Don't you dare," she said with fire in her voice. "You're already building walls, thinking I'd be safer without you. I'd just be alone. You asked me to marry you, and I said yes. The only way you protect me is by staying right here." He finally leaned into her touch. "Together, then." A soft kiss sealed their pact. In the light of day, the damage to the store looked a whole lot worse. "How can we possibly fix this?" Clara whispered, despair creeping back in. "I don't have any savings for this." Caleb's arm was a steady weight on her shoulders. "I've got some money put aside for new windows. I can do the repair work myself. We will make it work." Not an hour later, Sarah Pritchard arrived with breakfast and even better news. "The women of Red Hollow are having a work party," she said with a smile. "Folks are donating lumber and fabric. We take care of our own." For the first time, Clara truly felt she was home. For the next 2 weeks, the town came together. Men hammered and sawed while women brought food and scrubbed the floors clean. Caleb worked from sunup to sundown, laughing with the other men, looking more at peace than Clara had ever seen him. Sheriff McKenna stopped by one afternoon. "The Carver brothers confessed to everything," he reported. "They'll hang. You two should be safe." After he left, Caleb pulled Clara close. "I'm not staying because it's safe," he said. "I'm staying because I'm done running." He kissed her temple. "You're home." By Christmas, the store was rebuilt better than ever, brighter and stronger. Clara looked at their hard work. "It is more beautiful than before," she whispered. Caleb stood right behind her. "Just like us," he said softly. "Broken, but fixed up even stronger." They married on New Year's Day with half the town there to celebrate. When Caleb placed the simple gold band on her finger, she felt the weight of their journey. "I love you," he said, his voice thick. "My brave, stubborn wife." "I love you too," she answered back. "My broken, beautiful husband." They could hardly believe they were allowed this much joy. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked while they danced. "Not a chance," Caleb admitted. "I meant to save you and ride off alone. I figured my happy days were long gone." He held her tighter. "But you were just too stubborn to give up on me." "I am not sorry about that," she whispered. "Don't you ever be," he said. "It was the best thing that ever happened to me." Their life as a married couple started right there above the store, in the same room where lamplight once fell on his letters. It was the place they had learned to trust each other, so it felt right. As they went up the stairs, Caleb asked her, "Are you nervous?" Clara admitted she was terrified, but also deeply happy. Once inside, he held her face in his hands. He told her it was perfectly fine to be scared and sure all at once. That is just part of being human. And being human with her was better than anything else. Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet dark, Caleb knew he had to tell her something. He spoke about Mary, his first wife. He said that he would always love her, but what he felt for Clara was not less, just different. He explained that he and Mary had grown up together, but he and Clara had found each other after they were already broken by loss. And that, he said, made their bond something powerful. "We are choosing to love even though we know how much it can hurt," Clara said softly. Caleb turned to her in the moonlight. He wanted her to understand she was not a replacement for Mary. She was a new beginning. The next morning, they rode out to the ranch. The January air was sharp and cold. Caleb stood with Clara before the graves of his wife and daughter, and he properly introduced them. He mentioned selling the ranch to stay in town and be closer to her. Clara took his hand and stopped him right there. She said this place, his past, was part of him, and she had married all of him. The thought of abandoning it was not right. They would find a way to make it all work together. Looking at her, Caleb wondered how he ever got so lucky. She had saved his life, and she just kept on saving it. They settled into a life split between the ranch and the town, 3 days here, 4 days there. It was a rhythm that worked for them. But in April, everything changed. Clara realized she was pregnant. She sat on their bed, not with joy, but with a cold terror in her heart. What if she died like Mary? What if they had to bury another child on that hill? Caleb found her there with tears on her face and instantly knew. She whispered that she was pregnant and she was so scared. He rushed to her side and held her as she trembled. He promised they would get through it. He could not promise she would not die, but he promised they would find the best doctor in all of Montana, and he would be there to fight for her. "Are you not scared?" she asked him. He admitted he was terrified of losing her and the baby, but he was also filled with hope. Hope for a new life they could bring into the world together. He asked her, "Can we be both, scared and hopeful at the same time?" And she knew he was right. Their whole story was about being two things at once, broken and healing, afraid and brave. When they shared the news, the town of Red Hollow surrounded them with support instead of fear. Friends brought remedies, books, and handmade baby clothes. Even Tom Brewster showed up with a hand-carved cradle. Through the summer, Caleb's worry made him overprotective. He refused to let her lift anything. One evening, Clara gently took his hands. She told him she was pregnant, not fragile. She needed him to trust that she was strong enough for this and to believe they were going to be okay. Labor started on a cold November morning, a year to the day she first held the key to his ranch. The pain was immediate and fierce. Caleb paced the floor outside the bedroom, his face pale with fear. A friend told him that Clara was strong and would get through it, but Caleb just whispered that Mary had been strong too. When hours passed and Clara's screams echoed through the house, he could not stay outside any longer. He pushed into the room and took her hand. Her voice was weak from exhaustion. She made him promise that if things went wrong, he would take care of the baby. He promised through his own tears, but he insisted nothing would go wrong. He told her, "You are going to hold our baby, and we are going to raise this child together." "You will live to be 90, Caleb pleaded, his voice cracking. "You are not leaving me." Just then, a furious little cry cut through the tension. "You have a healthy boy," the doctor said. Caleb only looked at his wife. "Clara?" "I am okay," she whispered, exhausted. "Let me see him." As the baby was placed in her arms, her face lit with awe. He had her dark hair and Caleb's blue eyes. "Oh, Caleb, he is so beautiful." "What should we name him?" he asked. "George," Caleb decided. "After your uncle, who brought us together." Tears filled her eyes. "George Rowan. It is perfect." There they were, the three of them. A family made from hardship and a love that would not give up. Every milestone with their new son was a sweet pain for Caleb, a reminder of his lost daughter, Rebecca. Clara helped him by always speaking of her, telling George stories about the sister he would never meet. "Do you reckon she would like him?" Caleb asked one night. "She would love him," Clara said softly. "And she would be so proud of you for being brave enough to love again." The years that followed were full and good. The store thrived. They had 2 more children, a daughter called Molly, and a son, Thomas. Soon they built a house on land between the town and the ranch. George grew up with his mother's stubborn streak and his father's quiet strength. And he loved horses, just like his sister Rebecca had. Caleb taught him to ride on the same trails where he once rode alone with only his sorrow for company. Molly was a chatterbox, a little spitfire just like Caleb's own mother, Mary. Then there was Thomas, the calm one who loved the general store and was a natural at it. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb and Clara stood at the graveyard on the rise, looking at the stone markers for Mary and Rebecca. He finally admitted, "I still talk to them, you know. Tell them how you scorched supper last week." Clara laughed, leaning on his shoulder. "It was just a little crispy." "Honey, the smoke ran half the town off." He pulled her close. "I reckon Mary would have liked you. She'd appreciate how you don't let me get stuck in my own head. And little Rebecca would have loved having a house full of noise instead of ghosts." "I hope they know we haven't forgotten them," Clara said softly. "They know," Caleb whispered, kissing her hair. "And they're proud of us, I'm sure of it." Have you ever seen someone so beaten down by life they just gave up? That was Caleb, a man who lost everything hiding from the world, but then came Clara, an outsider who wouldn't let him stay broken. Their story became a local legend in Red Hollow, but the truth wasn't about some grand romance. It was about choosing to show up, day after day. It was about writing letters when talking was too hard. It was about building shelves, fixing what was broken, and holding on tight through the long nights. It was about making space in a shattered heart for a new love without ever forgetting the old one. If you believe in second chances, then you need to hear how they chose, over and over again, just to try. 23 years later, Clara stood on their porch at sunset. Caleb, now with silver in his hair, came up behind her. "What's on your mind?" "That first day," she said, "when you saved me from those bank robbers. Did you have any idea what you were starting?" He chuckled. "Not a clue. But seeing you there, something inside me woke up for the first time in 7 years. I felt like there might be a reason to keep going." "And the letters?" she asked. "That night I couldn't sleep. I knew you were alone trying to run that store, so I figured I could help. Give you advice without getting too close." He hugged her tighter. "That plan didn't quite work out." Clara smiled. "No, it worked out a whole lot better." "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked him quietly. "Letting me in?" "Never," Caleb said, turning her to face him. "Not for a single second. You gave me my life back, Clara. You gave me children and laughter, and a future I'd quit believing in." "We saved each other," she whispered. "We sure did," he said, and kissed her. The journey from that terrible day to this peaceful night was long and hard, but they made it, together. As they went inside, Caleb stopped her for one more kiss. "Thank you," he whispered, "for being too stubborn to let me disappear." She smiled. "Thank you for riding into town every day, even when it scared you." "Always," he promised. And he kept that promise, not with letters anymore, but by choosing her every single day. Years later, their children found a wooden box in the attic. Inside were all the letters, the paper yellowed with age. They read about leaky roofs and ordering supplies, about fear and hope. They saw the story of two wounded souls learning to trust again. George, a grown man himself, read the first letter aloud. "The leak in your roof is above the back corner. Patch it before the next rain." Molly smiled through her tears. So practical, just like Papa. "But he didn't have to help," Thomas said. "He could have stayed hidden, but he chose to reach out." They carefully put the letters back, a testament to choosing hope over fear, a love story that started in the dark and found its way into the light. In Red Hollow, folks still tell the story of the cowboy and the determined woman from back east. But the real story wasn't a legend. It was about two broken people who found each other at the edge of nowhere and decided to try. They proved that healing doesn't mean you forget what you lost. It means you make room for something new. They built a life that mattered, proving it is never too late to start over, never too late to choose love. It all happened because a man decided to write a letter instead of riding away, and a woman was brave enough to answer. That was the choice that changed everything. That was the choice that brought them both into the sunlight. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.